Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the first part of our two-part workshop on AI for scientific discovery. So I'm Akshay Jagadish. I'm a Perisman Scully postdoctoral research fellow in the Princeton AI Lab, part of the Natural and Artificial Minds program. And I'm going to be co-presenting this with Raja Mariye, who is a graduate student who's also part of the Natural and Artificial Minds program, and is a PhD student in the Cocosai lab with Tom Griffiths. Okay, so the broad overview of the talk today, so the first part of the talk is kind of going over how people have been using scientific AI for scientific discovery, and kind of also putting our twist on how we've been using it, and kind of getting also your take towards the end of how you think we should use it, or like what are the pitfalls and so on. And the second part tomorrow, where Raja, Solim, and Yunus are going to present more concrete research projects in more detail, where you can ask more clear questions about how we are doing it and so on. So today is more like an overview with some specific projects that we're doing, but tomorrow is going to be more detailed. So if you have more detailed questions, we can talk about it after this talk, but tomorrow is also when you can kind of ask more detailed questions. Okay, let's get to it. So I feel like we are in a golden age of using AI for scientific discovery. We have a lot of tools going on that are coming every day now that there's so much money and scale involved in AI, which is trying to help us accelerate scientific discovery. And we see papers such as this, where people have built virtual end-to-end labs where they have AI agents that can kind of go all the way from creating experiments to run those experiments and test them outside to come up with SARS-CoV, like this is like a COVID nanobodies that you can use actually to treat COVID. There's also such labs which are completely run autonomously, which allows you to discover new materials, such as this, where they use an autonomous lab, which actually has what do you call, like a wet lab associated with it, where you can actually run experiments and see whether the synthesized material is stable or not. And then finally, there are tools that allows you in mathematics to kind of do a program search over different algorithms that allow you to implement different ideas or test different theorems, which also leverage AI. And then lastly, this is a paper that came out yesterday where they have kind of used AI to automate the process of AI research itself, where they have a system that allows you to go from ideation, where it pulls a bunch of literature from the internet, starts with the ideation process, comes up with code that allows you to test those hypotheses, and can, based on how well it agrees with the literature and how interesting the results are, it iterates until it finds a result that it thinks by reviewing is interesting, and then kind of produce a paper. And they actually found that they were able to get 2 or 3 peer papers that were even able to be peer-reviewed in machine learning workshops. So all of this kind of indicate how current tools in AI are allowing us to kind of accelerate the process of scientific discovery in AI. And this has resulted in a lot of kind of review articles to make us think about how do we leverage these tools and how do we update the process of practice of science using tools like large language models. There's also people arguing that this is actually quite critical because humans suffer with issues such as biases. There's issues such as they're cognitively, some things are not possible given the space of hypothesis that one needs to test. So there's capacity limits to people, which AI allows you to solve. So in arguing that there's actually a necessary thing that we need in the scientific process. And there's also people kind of looking at how do we kind of scale this up to imagine a future where the entire process of scientific discovery can be done end-to-end with AI systems. So this is kind of a bunch of these papers are kind of looking at the future of how science might change with respect to now that we have these powerful AI agents. But the question is, what makes these systems so powerful? So I think there are like 4 key. So the first thing is, as we've seen from late 2021 and so on, that as the size of these models has scaled from a few billion parameters to now to scales up to 3 trillion parameters, that they have acquired new capabilities from language understanding, from physics question answering, to processing large amounts of text, to do common sense reasoning and solving arithmetic tasks, which is something that you get through scale in terms of both compute and also the data set. But critically, there are other 4 features that kind of comes with these systems that is particularly useful for the process of scientific discovery. So according to me, the 4 key features are starting with it can process large amount of literature of papers that has been produced, which is probably humanly impossible to kind of process and aggregate and kind of connect these ideas before you test any hypothesis. And this is something a large language model by definition has done this because it's been trained on a large corpus of internet data. The second thing is, given these models have been trained on these large scale data sets, they can actually discover patterns and connections within these data, allowing you to actually in silico make predictions for tasks that has not been included in the training set, allowing you to kind of scale up the process of scientific discovery by using these tools as engines for generating predictions. And the third thing that is quite powerful, which is according to me is one of the most strongest features of these LLMs, are the ability to code. Because these systems have been trained on large-scale, internet-scale data sets, large chunks of it, like with platforms such as GitHub and GitLab, is code. And code, by definition, is formalized and structured. And by training these models on this kind of language, like structured data, you can actually acquire the ability to code things at scale, which is something quite powerful, especially because you can actually read through this code to understand what exactly the system is doing. And given that these systems are formalized in a specific language, you can also run them in external interpreter, which has certain features that you care about, and so you can actually verify them at test time. And finally, beyond just having a single model do tasks, now we have harnesses that allow you to kind of get multiple agents with different roles working together to kind of solve complex tasks. So kind of now we have gone beyond just having a single model that you can talk to like ChatGPT, to having systems that are built around multiple of these agents with specific roles, with verifiable components and access to tools, allow you to kind of do things at scale that was not possible before. There's actually recent surveys, like specifically this benchmark called Meter, where they have been tracking what is the length of the task an individual LLM, in this case, was able to do. And as you can see, from early 2019 to up to 2026, there seems to be a constant increase in the duration of the task, like the total duration of the task that the models can automate. So in the beginning, they were doing small tasks such as question answering, kind of counting certain words and so on. But as these systems have scaled, up until recently with the Cloud Opus model, which came out a couple of months ago, they can do things which takes about an hour, like 10 hours to do. So although this kind of benchmark is something not completely curated in a way that many of the tasks between each other are not super comparable, so you should take this result with a grain of salt. But at a high level, what you can see is that, okay, the capacity of the systems has scaled, that now individual models are now capable of doing tasks that are beyond like a few 10 minutes or few order of minutes to something that can take an hour, like a few hours. And recently, there was also this system from the company Future House, where they showed that they have this end-to-end system that, according to them, working with academics, that it could do things a PhD-level researcher could do in a matter of 6 months. So if you get multiple of these agents together and provide the right data set sources and harnesses, they show that now these systems can now can go from beyond seconds to hours to even months. So indicating that with these tools, now we can actually do more longer and longer horizon problems, which is something which is key to ask hard and interesting scientific questions. So now to going a bit specific into how exactly are the systems accelerating scientific discovery. So to do that, I want to take a step back to think about broadly how scientific workflow is designed. So as many of you know, in many of these projects, you start with an ideation process where you think about specific research questions that you care about, that you want to answer, followed by you do an extensive literature review to figure out how people have studied these problems, how to frame the problems, and how the solutions are looking at. And then you come up with your own theoretical or methodological approach to address the questions of interest. If you're somewhere in behavioral sciences, you create experiments that you can run on people to gather data sets that you care about. And then following which you analyze the data test against your theoretical predictions to see if the data that you collect agrees with those predictions. And you kind of iterate this process until you're satisfied. As you see the squiggly lines in between, it's not like a clearly linear process that we go from ideation all the way to the writing where you get all the results, but it's like a meandering between the different levels. But once you're happy with it, you go into the writing process, and if you're following the scientific code, then you tend to put it out, you get peer reviews, you iterate until it matches certain standard, following which the paper is accepted and disseminated through research venues. So today I will maybe highlight parts of this process that AI is accelerating. For example, there's AI which has been used for accelerating literature reviews. There's AI that is used for gathering data. There's actually tools that allow you to come up with methodological or theoretical approaches to analyze data and kind of understand structure in the data. There's also tools such as Prism that OpenAI has released that allow you to kind of integrate AI in the process of writing, which is something that I will not go deeper into, but I just want to quickly highlight that even this part of the pipeline is something that people are looking at. And finally, there is things like peer review, that there is this tool, for example, from Stanford called the Stanford Agentic Reviewer, where you can upload any preprint that you have onto their website, and it gives you like a peer review that you can kind of use to iterate on your paper before even you submit anything anywhere. So yeah, so these are the parts of the pipeline that I will be focusing on. And then we can dig into each one step by step. So starting with literature synthesis and ideation. So one of the first works that came about in kind of using these modern agentic systems for literature review was this work from Future House, where they kind of built an agent. I think they call it as Crow, where they have language agents that allow you to kind of synthesize scientific knowledge across many different papers. So they train a model from scratch that where they take, or rather they take a pre-trained language model and then they fine-tune it on data from the literature, and they want to see how well they can synthesize this human knowledge. To do that, they kind of take data sets up to a certain point, and they come up with a benchmark that allows you to test how well it can kind of use the pre-existing knowledge to predict something coming in the next step. And they show that the system was able to kind of synthesize knowledge across different domains and tasks quite well, and in many cases even beyond what a human can do, who obviously they're not comparing it to an expert who has been in a topic for many years, but they're comparing it to some PhD student who's like given the literature and have to synthesize this work. There's similar work from Allen Institute where they also kind of built an AI2-based scholar that allows you to ask question answers in the literature, where if you have a specific question of interest that you care about, then you can use their tool to see how it fits with the literature, whether it's an interesting question that you want to care about, and are there gaps. And finally, there are also tools that people are releasing that allows you to even extrapolate into predicting more, into producing more interesting novel ideas. So there is this paper, and there's a recent paper called Alien Sciences, where they train a model until time t+1, until time t, and they want to predict how novel the idea is at time t+1. And they try to build a predictive engine based on a transformer, and they try to maximize the new idea to be in a way that it is more novel at time t+1. So there are a lot of tools such as this that one can use to systematically, given the literature of the past, produce ideas that is slightly different or like beyond what is present in the literature. The second more important use case, which has been in the last couple of years ago, was one of the most popular ways of using AI was the idea of foundation models. So the foundation model, one of the most popular and the more powerful foundation model was the AlphaFold model. So the AlphaFold model was trained on the protein database, which was alpha amino acid structure that people had curated over generations with multiple labs. And they pre-trained the model on those, allowing you to now predict structure of novel protein structures. And obviously, as many of you know, this work and the follow-up of it also won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. And so once AlphaFold came out, people started kind of expanding on this work and kind of releasing foundation models across different domains. And this is another work where they did the same on a material science data set, and they showed that you can actually scale up material science predictions or like stability of materials using deep learning approaches, which is another foundation model people have looked at. And then finally, in neuroscience, there was also a new foundation model that came out last year where they took a data set from mice over performing a visual task where they see a bit of stimulus and they are performing free viewing, and they collect the neural data from that, and they pre-train a model that, given the history of frames and the neural activations, can predict the activation for the next visual frame. So this is another very powerful way of using foundation models, which is using these engines to kind of get in silico predictions for new data points, which in history that you would have to run an experiment to collect the data for. But now with these tools, you can actually use them to generate in silico predictions and in silico predictions for the data. And then finally, this is a use case that I find quite powerful. As I mentioned before, code synthesis is something these models are extremely good at, also because of the way the data the models are trained on, but also because it's verifiable, interpretable, and allows you to get hands-on understanding of what the systems are doing. So in this case, again, one of the more recent works, which came out last year again, was the AlphaEvolve agent. So in AlphaEvolve, they have multiple. They have an agent that has an evolutionary search approach. It takes an evolutionary search-based approach to come up with novel code bases. So it's not producing small code snippets, but it produces entire code bases to kind of come up with to solve algorithmic problems. In this case, they actually showed that you can come up solutions for matrix multiplications or sorting algorithms, which was some of the use cases which was considered more or less solved. And this approach can allow you to kind of find interesting solutions or like more novel solutions to help you solve this problem. There is also, prior to this AlphaEvolve, was the fun search paper, where they do, instead of generating entire code bases, here they generated specific Python functions functions. And here they show that you can actually use these approaches to make mathematical discoveries. And finally, more recently, a couple of days ago, building upon some of the work from AlphaEvolve and fun search, now people do meta-evolution over this entire process, where you're not having components of the evolutionary search process in the first few approaches, which was fixed, where a researcher goes through and figures out, okay, what is the specific setting that you want to use for doing your evolutionary search. In this case, there is a meta-algorithm that actually searches over the space of those hypotheses, allowing you to kind of do meta-evolution over these automated coding-based discovery systems. So I feel like these three use cases are quite exciting, because whatever solution the LLM comes with, you can actually go back and take a look at them, understand them, and you can actually use them to integrate in your systems, or you can kind of take these systems and scale it for cases where we don't have an algorithmic solution to solve the problem. Going beyond kind of using these agents or agentic systems to kind of solve specific targeted tasks, such as literature review or prediction or code synthesis, there are now end-to-end systems that kind of automate the full process of scientific discovery, where there is this Google's AI co-scientist agent, where a scientist in this case actually defines a problem, what they know about the problem, potential proposals as to how they think people are solving this problem, and what is the shape of the solution they care about. They give that as scientific input as a research goal to an AI co-scientist, and it does the rest of the process end to end, where it does a research proposal, it goes back and implements a solution, it has a reflection agent that sees the potential generated solution makes sense or not, but there's an evolution agent that continuously evolves the existing ideas so that you're not stuck in certain ideas, but you're constantly coming up with new ideas. And they have a reviewer that takes a look at how good the idea is, and you iterate. So essentially this process allows you to get access to an AI co-scientist, where you as a researcher define a problem and a solution and how you structure the solution, and then you ask an AI agent to kind of do this for you, and then you iterate with the agent to then come to a solution. So here in this case, your goal as a scientist is to think about what the interesting problem is, what are the potential solutions you think are interesting, and also think about the shape of the solutions for this problem. Another recent version of this is doing very similar is the AI scientist. Again, it came out in Nature yesterday, where they again do a very similar process, where they ask an LLM to propose an idea, they do another LLM to do novelty checking, they score the ideas from this the final the ideas that get passed through the novelty, and they have a bunch of agents that allow you to come up with a code base to implement the idea, to do hyperparameter tuning of these ideas, execute it, test it through ablation studies, and you iterate this process many, many times. And when you're satisfied, you plot the results, you write the paper, get the reviewer, and you iterate the process over and over and over again. So this is kind of more towards the end state of how you can use these tools, where without any human in the loop, the LLM itself does the entire process completely autonomously. So this is kind of moving towards the edge case. Now, recently, yesterday, from the Harvard Kempner Institute, there was this new initiative where, building upon the idea of you have AI-based autonomous agents, they built a platform where you let AI agents just talk to each other. So this is like the OpenClaw version for science, where multiple agents propose ideas, they give access them to run experiments, they come up with hypotheses themselves, they test those hypotheses and let the other agents in the platform discuss them, criticize them, and think about potential ways to get better. And they do this process end to end, kind of building a social network of AI scientists to do kind of this autonomous discovery. Yeah. So broadly, these are some of the ways that people have been looking at in the literature, kind of looking at more controlled small-scale condition where they're doing specific tasks, to all the way to these end-to-end autonomous systems. Going forward, in the next part of the talk, Raja will talk about specific use cases, which is what we have been doing in how do we leverage these tools for behavioral sciences.
Cool. Thank you. Can you hear me? Just checking. Cool. Great. Yeah, so we're going to sort of do a deep dive on how these tools have been applied to the behavioral sciences. And in doing so, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on, just the basic idea of using AI models to understand human behavior, but then we're going to increasingly make things more and more complicated, using AI agents to help us think about behavioral data, and then thinking about human-AI interaction in more complex pipelines. So yeah, so the way I would think about it is that there are three main roles in which AI has been sort of very helpful and transformative in the behavioral sciences. First one is, using AI as a comparison class. We've never had before models that are so expressive, so general, that you could just, take your behavioral experiment and run them through it. And this has been a key of, why these models have been very helpful in automating the process of understanding behavioral data. Then there is another element, which is using AI agents as facilitators of scientific pipelines. So how can we use AI agents to maybe run our data analysis, think about certain types of things that, for example, psychologists or behavioral scientists have to deal with, and think, is there a way in which I can give this to an agent? Is everything okay? Closer to me? Okay, no worries. Cool. And then the last part is going to be sort of zooming out a little bit more and thinking not only about systems of AI agents that are running processes for us, but really about AI as interactive agents that operate in, human AI ecosystems that are, evolving over time, and how can we think about, the pitfalls, but also, the benefits of that, and how can we do a science of that. Cool. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about background on AI as a comparison class. So I would say there's a new kind of synergy in the behavioral sciences that's been happening over the past few years, which is people have been realizing, as Akshay pointed out, that these models that we have now are really expressive and very powerful. They're very flexible. And this gives us a unique opportunity to use them as a way of understanding the human mind, which is also pretty flexible, and we didn't have models that match it in any way before. But on the other hand, there's another aspect to the synergy, which is as these models get larger and larger, they also become more opaque. And people in the cognitive sciences have spent decades thinking about how do we make sense of these, the mind as a black box using behavioral measures. And so there's been a really fruitful sort of two-way process. And I'll just, because I know that the audience is pretty from different backgrounds, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that. And it will set the ground for some of the other things that Akshay will talk about. So let's start from the aspect of that these large models are quite flexible. So this has been sort of reflected in cognitive science in different ways. First of all, in terms of our ability to build powerful predictive models. So Akshay mentioned this idea of foundation models that are able to perform in different tasks. So people also have invested efforts in taking, large amounts of behavioral data from, on different tasks, training a very large model, and using that as a predictive model for understanding human behavior. Sometimes even models like GPT out of the box already give us gains in our ability to, for example, to do psychological text analysis in different languages, which was, quite surprising given, the very large data set that, the very messy data set, I guess, that these things are trained on. And then even more than that, these models have been shown to be very useful in predicting, for example, brain responses, or even like thinking about what kind of sentences are going to drive certain parts of the human, of the brain, basically. And so one interesting thing that came out of this is this idea that we can revisit now classic questions in psychology that people have thought about for a while using these new kind of tools. So for example, things like asking, what can be learned from language? So we have these very flexible models that are trained on a huge corpus of text. They can participate in the tasks that our participants take part in. If we look at their behavior in this case, can we make inferences about how far can you go based on language? And I've worked on this, but also multiple other people have been sort of using their favorite cognitive paradigm to make sense of that. And then there's, I guess the next level of that is to take things like maybe, a recording of a child's experience and training a model on that using these transformer architectures, and really tap into, questions in cognitive science that people have been thinking about for decades. Is the stimulus really that dull, or can you actually learn a lot from it? And then sort of flipping the arrow, there's this element of opaqueness, and cognitive science have been really helpful in making sense of these very large models. Things like thinking about, what are the general goals that these systems are trying to solve, using things like Bayesian models, or all sorts of behavioral data analysis techniques people use to make sense of when these models work or they don't work. Things like using behavioral paradigms for detecting social bias that maybe might be implicit in things that might seem at face value as unbiased. And then if you're interested in learning more about these, this is just like the tip of the iceberg. So we recently wrote a review paper about what cognitive science had to offer for better understanding AI models. So I'm going to tell you about one very simple case study. So people have been using much more complex, things have evolved a lot since this study, but I think it demonstrates how, these models can give us a nice comparison class to ask questions. So the question is, how much of our sensory experiences can be recovered from language? So this is something that, not only psychologists, but people in philosophy have thought a lot about. And they said, some people are like, I don't know, it's not going to work. Some other people have said, actually, it's going to work amazingly well, et cetera. But we didn't have a model to sort of turn this into quantitative science. And the nice thing is that, these large language models, they give us a way to tap into that. So let me give you sort of a very brief review of how cognitive scientists have been thinking about quantifying what we mean by, sensory experiences. So one way to understand how people perceive a certain domain, maybe something like colors, builds on the idea of similarity. So there are many things that vary in the world, but people seem to have a very clear sense of whether two things are similar or not, even though nothing is exactly the same. So using this idea of similarity, cognitive scientists have sort of used it as a way of accessing how people organize a certain sensory domain. So the basic paradigm is very simple. I present you, say, with two stimuli, maybe two colors if I'm interested in colors, and I ask you to rate how similar you think they are. And notice that similar is by design is something that is very vague. It really leaves it to the agent to pick up on whatever is relevant for them. And so by comparing every possible pair of colors from a given set, we can construct a similarity matrix where a cell in the similarity matrix is essentially the degree of perceived similarity between a pair of stimuli. And then I can run a data analysis process, maybe something like an embedding algorithm that represents the stimuli as points in space, and distances between them are respecting their similarity. So there's a classic study in cognitive science by Shepard in the 80s where he showed that by simply analyzing this kind of data, we can recover something like the color wheel. Or maybe if I look at something like a similarity between different beeps, like auditory frequencies, which are one-dimensional, you discover that actually the mental organization of this domain is something maybe like a helix, reflecting, if you play the piano, it's like the key identity and the height, the register. And so given this kind of data, which is about direct sensory judgments, we can ask, how far can these models that are trained on language predict such sensory judgments? So the idea is that we can elicit similarity judgments directly from large language model as a proxy for sensory intuitions derived from language. So without telling you too much about the details, we literally took standard models. We presented them with text descriptors of the stimuli. So for example, in the case of colors, I said people describe pairs of colors using, it could be their hex codes, it could be their names. We tried all of these. And then we say, how similar do you think these colors? And then the model just gives you a score, say 0.3. And then what you can do is you can take human data that is derived from people observing stimuli, rating their similarity, and then correlate. And what we found is that these models, especially things like GPT-3, were able to give us reliable correlations in terms of predicting human judgments purely based on language. And if you further analyze these structures, you see that these models even seem to encode things like the color wheel and the pitch helix and many more mental representations. And I should say, in the spirit of we can study things both ways, we can use similarity judgment to characterize, for example, how large models process things like numbers, where we have practical applications. And you can use that, for example, to show how they can misinterpret numbers as something in between, say, a letter and an actual number. And you can use that to predict when these models are going to fail. So to summarize, modern AI systems provide a powerful comparison class, whether foundation models or maybe even simpler models. And we can use them to revisit classic questions about mind and brain. And also at the same time, cognitive science can help us better understand opaque models by using the same tools that have been used to study the mind and bringing them back into AI. So this really gives us sort of the basic foundations for moving one step further up and thinking about AI agents as facilitators of scientific pipelines, as data generators that can be used to test all sorts of cognitive theories. So I'll give this to Akshay.
Hi Akshay, thank you so much for a great workshop. I had a quick question. So I'm interested in how AI agents can facilitate structuring data because, for example, something like drug discovery, there's so much scientific literature that's like unstructured text for agents and LLMs. So how can we employ AI agents and how can they be better at something like causal inference in unstructured data better than LLMs?
So the question is, how can we use AI agents to get a better causal understanding of data sets like drug discovery beyond just foundation model-based approaches? I mean, I guess it's an interesting question. So I guess one way you could kind of get around it is, obviously a foundation model is pre-trained on a certain data set, and it's only trying to predict condition on the tokens it has seen in the past. Right? One way to go around it with agentic systems is you can have another agent propose experiments, right? And this agent gives you a prediction, right? And then you can actually iterate until and then you have a verifier that allows you to kind of test what is like potentially the case that you want to test for cases where for a subset of the case where the ground truth. So by having like these agents interacting with one another, where one agent is kind of coming up with adversarial experiments, whereas another agent is trying to make a prediction, and then you have a verifier that tells you whether it's correct or not, and then you iterate, allows you to get a better foundation model that has a better understanding of these data sets, right? And then you can take that and then do some of the tests that you want to care about, because many of the times it's very restrictive for asking a single agent to do all the job in the pipeline, because it's kind of doing many tasks, like needle in the haystack kind of a problem, where you have a lot of data and let's figure out what is there to next. And one way to kind of get around it is to have different agents with specific roles and having very clear, predictable outcomes that you can use to iterate. And then that is one way to get around it. You can also generate outputs as programs rather than just getting a prediction, right? And then those programs are what you can then use to do. There's a very nice work from Katie Collins and others from MIT, where they look at, given some inductive problems of games, for example, of people playing, I don't know, boat races and so on, they asked the LLM to kind of come up with a probabilistic program that explains how they might be solving the task. And this program kind of captures the causal kind of factors that people care about when they make a prediction, as how strong a person is when they won the race, or what time of the day did they do the task. And all of this is kind of taken together in this kind of Python program. And good thing about a program is it's something that you can morph and change with feedback, where it's not just a prediction, but it's something that is held outside that you can iterate. That's one way to kind of go around it.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Anybody else? Okay, then we go ahead with the next part of the talk. Cool. Yeah, as Raja mentioned, we kind of started off with a very specific use case of how we can use a single instance of a model to do in silico prediction, or better understand, or like use them as a model of cognitive system, where you want to understand how potentially the brain might be doing it, but also the other way, trying to use tools from AI, or like tools from cognitive science to understand AI systems. So in the next part of the talk, I want to kind of go one scale up, as Raja mentioned, and talk a bit more about, in the space of cognitive science, how can we think about automating the process of scientific discovery. So this is a recent article that we put out there. It's under review. It was an invited piece from Neuron in the NeuroView opinion piece section, where we kind of pitched an idea of how we think we can potentially automate the process of scientific discovery in cognitive science, and not just to specific aspects of the cognitive science pipeline. So to start with that, so what we propose is there's 4 key parts of the pipeline. So the first part of the pipeline is assuming, let's say you have a specific question that you want to understand. In this case, let's say you want to understand how people learn from rewards, or maybe to keep it more simple, let's assume the question you're interested in is how do people make decisions based on some features that they see. So let's say you go to a supermarket and you have to choose between a certain type of juice, and you kind of look at different juice, different varieties of juice, the brands, their different aspects that they have in terms of the different nutrients which they include and so on. You kind of look at those labels, and you want to decide what you want to take and choose among in terms of what product you want to buy. So you want to kind of start with a task in that space. So in this case, the task is you have 2 options that you want to care about, and the features of the options are the attributes that you want to care and what values they take. So you can kind of encapsulate this, if you think about as an experiment, as features and the number of options, and how the features and number of options are contrasted on another. So you can kind of view this as some form of a grammar. So if you have a program that allows you to kind of capture this grammar, then you can actually generate arbitrary number of such tasks by sampling from this program. An additional thing that would be of interest is, if you want to understand how different humans actually solve the task, it would be nice to be able to also capture something like, okay, how do people at different age groups or different sex or different education kind of make the decisions in these tasks. So another factor that you might care about is something like the metadata information as to who these people are, what features they come with, like the demographic features or psychometric features, like if they have psychiatric issues or genetic risks and so on. So imagine that you have access to many of these demographic and psychometric features, and you have a grammar that allows you to kind of generate these kind of probabilistic tasks at scale. This is something you can do with now modern AI agents. If you specify a language that allows you to synthesize these experiments, you can use these systems to kind of fill this experimental space to generate arbitrary samples, which is much more driven based on the literature than randomly sampling from this space. And once you sample such an experimental grammar from this experimental grammar, what you can do is you can use something like Centaur, which is the foundation model which Raja spoke about, to actually allow you to give synthetic data sets for this particular parameterization. So you present like this decision-making task where you have two different options with certain features. And now we have a new version of Centaur where it can also take the metadata information, as the model has been trained on like the age of the person, the sex, the education, and so on, followed by the decisions. So the model has learned to kind of use those metadata features to change its prediction. So by having access to such a model, now you can actually synthetically simulate how people of these different demographic and psychometric factors behave on the distribution of tasks that you kind of create through the grammar. So once you have a grammar and predictions from these tasks, the next step typically people do in cognitive science is you want to, before I go into the next step, I wanted to quickly mention that tomorrow in the workshop, there are aspects of this that Yunus is going to talk about. He's going to talk about one is the SpeedBean language, which is a language that allows you to specify different experiments within language. So you can describe a lot of different tasks by specifying in this language. And he's also going to talk about how you can actually create new generations of these foundation models by automatically creating a large-scale repository of tasks. So where you're given a paper and the link to the data set, their pipeline allows you to pre-process the data in a format that allows you to then go and pre-train a language model. So allowing you to kind of scale up the process of coming up with foundation models, because that was one of the bottlenecks of the pipeline. But anyway, this is something that Yunus is going to talk about tomorrow. I just wanted to quickly mention this. But the key thing that of interest for us now is the SweetBean is a language that allows you to express a lot of tasks from the psychology literature by specifying parameters, as you see here in the slide, the fixation, which is how long the item is on the screen, the order in which the stimulus are placed, which option is with the value the different options take, and so on. You can kind of come up with thousands of different variations of like a specific task that you see on the screen. And then, obviously, then you can run this. You can get the textual description of the task, which you see on the top right, where you have, this is the fixation cause, there is a rapid succession, and then you have a bunch of different information of the task in natural language. You can then query the foundation model to get their choices for under these different settings. So this allows you to get the behavioral data for these tasks. So yeah, going back, so now that if you have a way to synthetically generate in silico choices for these different experiments that you, again, synthetically created, the next task of interest for all of us is how do you then understand what is going on in the foundation model, right? As the question that came up before is a foundation model is pretty good in kind of making predictions for held out tasks that the model has never seen before, but this is not telling you how or why the model is doing that. Right? So the next part of the pipeline is given the choices the model makes and under what conditions, which is the setting of the experiment and some of the parameters that was given to the model to kind of simulate, like the metadata information, you can get the choices of the model. And given the choice of the model, then you want to go and construct an interpretable program that gives you an explanation of how the model is trying to solve the task. So this part of the pipeline is called Gecko, which I will talk to you now in more detail, where the goal is to figure out how this foundation model is doing the task and also get an interpretable function that can help you describe the task, kind of helping you go from an experiment to a potential model or a theory. So I will talk a bit about this part of the pipeline because this is something that I did last year in my PhD. So the pipeline is called Generation of Computational Cognitive Models, or Gecko in short. So the idea of Gecko is you start with the high-level prompt, where the prompt is the task that you're given to the participant. In this case, this is the same task that you can give that for which you synthetically generated the data. So in this case, participants are presented with two actions, and they observe feedback based on their choice. So going back to the juice example, participants are seeing two different juice with different features, and they have to choose a certain type of juice, and they're given certain feedback. Right? So that would be the task description that goes into the model. following which you get the data from the participant. This is something I mentioned is something you can generate in silico by using Centaur, where you can use this agent to give at each trial different actions and the rewards that it took. And then once you have the task description and the data, you have to specify certain guardrails, which is how the program should be generated, how the program should be structured, how many different programs that the model has to generate, and some guardrails so that it doesn't go off the rails. And finally, you also provide the code template, which gives you a high-level input-output combination of what does this interpretable model take as inputs. So in this case, it takes the actions the person took and the rewards, which is the rewards they got for each trial. And it also takes something like a parameter, which are these interpretable parameters, is the interpretable model components that interacts with how the model solves the task. And you provide that as a template to this prompt. So once you specify all of this as a prompt in context, you then pass it to LLM of your choice. So in this case, we considered a bunch of open source LLMs, such as the Llama model, the Qwen, and the DeepSeek R1. And you prompt these systems to produce, in this case, 3 different cognitive models. So each of these cognitive models, I'll give you an example in a bit, are models that take these parameters as input. It has interpretable ways of which these actions and rewards are mapped to one another. It's like a function approximator, but the function approximator has series of lines which you can read and understand how the inputs are going to get processed to result in the output. And once you generate the programs, you can then kind of test how well these programs are by fitting them to held out data sets that the model has not seen before. And this gives you some form of a score of how good these models are. So this is very important because you need a way for the system to know how good the proposed solutions are. And the proposed solutions are then iterated. So this is a critical step where you leave out some data which is not there in the prompt. And you use that to come up with a score as to how good the performance is. And then you use that feedback to put it back into the prompt. So you append the information based on what was the best model generated so far, based on your score, what are the different things the model has tried, and then you append all of this back to the original prompt and you repeat the process. So you can repeat the process over and over again over many iterations. And what we see is that the performance of these generated models monotonically goes down. So it gets better and better over the course of the iteration. And you can choose a certain criterion of when you want to stop, where after 5 iterations, when the model is no longer improving, or whenever you think, or if you have a compute limitation that you run it for a specific number of iterations, you run it until then. Once you're happy with that, you take the best generated model fit on the held out data set. So the model, while doing this process of iteration, is not seeing the data set that was seen in the prompt. So it is using an held out data set to improve. And then you take the generated model, and then you can test it on any other data sets you want to see how well the generated model performs on. So what we did is we took this model and tested on a test set, which the model has neither seen in the iteration process or in the prompt. And then we see how well these models perform against models from the literature. So the paper from which we got the data from, they had their own reference model. So we can compare it against that to see how good these models are. And then you can also perform some checks where you don't want the model purely predictive, that it just predicts the next choice, but you also want to see if the process the model uses can also allows you to generate something meaningful. So this is a pipeline that we came up with that allows you to come up with interpretable programs that explains the data set without having to train a foundation model, but you get that by sampling these programs from the LLM. To go back to the example which I quickly mentioned, like the case of the juice. So the task, an example task that we looked at is a decision-making task where you have 2 different options. Again, you can think about this as the 2 different types of juice. And each of these juices have 4 different features, feature 1 to 4. And your goal is to choose between 2 options. So this is a task that people have studied a lot in psychology. This is called a multi-attribute decision-making task, where people want to understand when people are shown these 2 different options with different features, how do they weigh the different features to predict a target? So you can do something like you only look at 1 feature at a time, which is a heuristic in the literature called take the best, where you only look at 1 feature and use that to make a decision. Or you can do a weighted combination of all the features to make a decision. Or you can kind of weigh all the features equally and then make a decision. So in the literature, people have tried all of these different heuristics to see which one maps onto how people learn. So in the paper, we looked at the winning model was PVAD, which is probabilistic weighted additive model. And compared to that, the programs we generate from these 3 different LLMs, which is the R1, Llama, and the Quen model, they perform significantly better because, so in this case, in terms of the measurement, lower is better. We are trying to predict the log likelihood of the choices under some complexity constraints. So according to this measure, what we find is the models that we generate from our sampling approach is much better than what we see in the literature. We simulated data from this model to see how well it agreed with human choices. We see that they're not just predictive, but also can simulate human choice as well. And if you go back and then look at the program the LLM generates, that is where you can get some intuition as to how the agents are trying to solve the problem. And this is the new capacity of these systems, that given these data sets, now you can go back and understand not just a system that can predict data, but can also understand how exactly they predict it. So in this specific case, what the model did is, when you have 2 different options that you want to predict based on their validities. So validities are the values that the experimenter tells that which one is more important than the other. So this is given to the participant, that according to them, this is how important each features are. And what the model neatly does here is, it takes the validity which is given to them and it raises it to a power. Since the validity score is given to the person is between 0 to 1, by raising it to an exponent, what it does is, you can, by changing the exponent, you can do something like take the best by having a really high value. You can kind of decay all the other parameters, only focusing on the first value. And if you set the parameter to 0, you can kind of weigh all the features equally. And if you set it to anything other than 0, you can kind of learn the weights for the different features. So what this model does is, with a single parameter, allowing you to capture how people arbitrate between 2 different strategies in the case of the experiment. So this is an example where that a model can actually predict data quite well, but allow you to also understand how exactly you can predict that. And here, the particular feature that it uses to predict is compression. We actually then went on to, we tried this on a bunch of different paradigms. I'm not showing you just to sake of brevity, but a cool thing is, you can take this model and then compare it to how well it performs compared to the foundation models. So the Centaur is the foundation model that we have, which Raja explained before, where you've trained this model on a bunch of different human data to predict human choices. And what we show is that our LLM produced program, which is the small snippets of code that is interpretable, can actually perform as good, or even in many cases better than the Centaur. So indicating that you can go beyond just predicting behavior or also understanding it by using this program synthesis idea. So you can get best of both worlds, where you get good predictions, but also getting interpretability that a program provides. So we have a bunch of different extensions of this work. So tomorrow, tomorrow Daniel is going to be talking about autorep, where we extended this pipeline to study representational similarity. This is the question which Raja mentioned, where you're given 2 different colors, you want to understand the underlying structure. We give the same problem to autorep, where it tries to, given the similarity judgments, figure out the underlying structure, and it comes up a bunch of different algorithms to represent the underlying data, which is quite a neat extension of this pipeline. If you're interested in this, Daniel is going to be talking more in detail. And then Solim is going to be talking about how we can use this program synthesis approach to figure out how people do complex visual reasoning tasks. So given an existing set of programs that can explain a given task, or you use to generate the data for a task, can you mutate those programs in a way that it helps you to understand how humans, when they solve the task, the types of errors they make. And you can use this approach to come up with a library of different types of errors people can perform, and you can get a handle of how people kind of solve these visual reasoning tasks. This is again the human arc data set, and some of these results is something that Solim is going to be talking to you about tomorrow. Cool. Going back to the pipeline of where we have a grammar generating experiments, Centaur simulating data for the experiments, and then Gecko coming up with interpretable programs for the experiment. The missing component of this entire pipeline is, how do we then go from these models to a theory? And in order to do that, we want to be able to exploit on the factors that these models are, on key factors from these models. So one way to do this is For a distribution of tasks that you sample from and the distribution of models, you can actually use a theoretician agent that allows you to rate these different programs based on interestingness, novelty, how well it fits the literature, and some form of qualitative measure in terms of how interesting these results are. And then you can use this to iterate over the different models and questions that you care about, and then use this to update your experimental hypothesis. So in our case, for example, you have a model here that allows you to arbitrate between two choices based on this single parameter. What the theoretician would do is, okay, if this is exactly how people do the task, where there is a single parameter arbitrating this, how can we come up with an experiment that allows you to stress test this model to see if it is actually indeed the case that that is how these models do this task? So what it would do is it come up with an hypothesis that allows you to break the model, and you can use that to construct an experiment, pass through the pipeline, and you can test if that is actually a model that still stays true or not. So by repeating this cycle of coming up with experiments, testing, generating in silico data, a model that predicts this data, and breaking those models under these conditions, if you repeat this process over and over again, you can kind of, the models and theories that surface are the ones that kind of work across many different experiments, many different tasks and paradigms. And the idea is, by doing this process completely in silico without having to include humans in the loop, you can actually come up with many interesting ideas that you can then take and test on humans to verify if that is indeed how they actually solve the task. But obviously, this is a potential way to solve the problem, but there are many key missing pieces. And one of the things that is fundamentally a problem with AI for science approaches is many of these things are very useful when the problem specification is very neatly defined and there is a shape of the solution is quite clear. And this is something that Sam Gershman and Ruad Battleday have discussed about the easy and hard problems in science. So what they talk about is that AI is very useful to solve some of these easy problems, according to them, where you clearly specify the shape of the problem, how you want to specify the problem solutions. You already remove the unnecessary chunks of information and only give it the things that you care about. And you also know how the solution should potentially look like. And then in these cases where you have to search through the existing, search through a space to find a solution, AI is extremely good at. But if you ask it to solve problems where we don't even know what information that should be passed to it, you don't know how the shape of the solutions should look like, this is something these models will struggle with. In our existing pipeline as well, we assume that you know the question of interest. You assume we know the task language allows you to express experiments in that space. In that case, you can actually do the loop. But in cases where we don't even know how to specify the experiment or the model, this is something that these systems will struggle with. And that is something that is potentially an important problem to think about in the future. And another key component is there is no human in the loop in the current pipeline that we proposed, that in each part of the pipeline is an isolated AI system where you have an agent designing experiments, you have an agent simulating data on those experiments, coming up with models and theorizing over the existing models. In no part of the loop there is humans except at the problem of specification. But I think there is a key, there is a lot of key contributions humans can do by placing themselves in different parts of the pipeline and also thinking more deeply about how to specify the problem formulation or think more harder about harder questions. And this is something Raja is going to talk about next, about how do we kind of go beyond this human out-of-loop systems to have create complex systems where humans are closely involved. Before that, just to quickly summarize, I talked to you about a potential end-to-end system for performing scientific discovery for cognitive sciences, which is more or less ready for deployment because each part of the pipeline is something that we have working. It's in pretty good shape, as I mentioned, to kind of solve some of these easy problems in science where you know the experimental paradigm, you know the shape of the experiments and the models where you can actually do that. But some of these things will potentially not work if you let these systems do it in a more isolated way. And one way to do this is to think about broadly where and how do you want humans to be incorporated in this loop, and what are the factors where humans are themselves general purpose learners allow you to solve, which AI agents are still not there to solve. And that is going to be the next part of the talk, which Raja is going to talk about.
Yes, are there any questions before we move to that?
Yeah.
And a quick question on curiosity. Hold on just for a second.
Sorry, the mic.
Yeah, just talking about like the general problems in AI for science. I was wondering when you developed Gecko,
Yeah.
if you.
I don't think it's on.
Yeah, I was wondering if, like, for example, the template itself, did you have to iterate through different types of templates before, and then did the solution change based on the minor specification differences which you didn't think really mattered?
I think it depends on the approach. And if you let the system run long enough, it doesn't matter as much because you also start providing the best model as feedback into the system, right? So in some sense, it already also starts getting to know what type of solutions they are. And if you also take evolutionary search hypothesis, evolutionary search-based approaches, there you're also constantly sampling parent programs that you pass. So the template is only useful for the first part where you want to synthesize a few programs, but after that, the system kind of becomes self-sufficient in the sense that it has a lot of different parents that you can choose from, and then you can kind of, these are already always getting added to the prompt anyway. So the prompt is not the single thing that is driving, the behavior anymore, but the parent programs as well. So in that case, the effect kind of decreases. Thank you. Athena.
Sorry, wasn't that fast. Yeah, that's really cool. I guess my question is like, you around like the easy and hard problems, we could test like hard problems in that you train the models on like a certain amount of data. I guess you like retrain a foundation model, which isn't that hard, or which is hard, sorry. Where you give it like, there's this example like you train it up to like the information that Einstein had before he created relativity. You could imagine something similar with behavioral data where you try to give it this like much information and you test the system to like try and discover something that we know but the model doesn't know. In that instance, this actually like really stress test the system, because I think then it's like we actually do know that a very concrete answer, which would be a way to solve this like hard problem and like actually stress test these systems. And this is kind of like a broader question: is like how do you actually know these systems are working well? Yeah. We all know they're very good at interpolating across these entire distributions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. There is actually a recent paper from Andrea Stolius' group from Stanford, where given the planetary movement information, they wanted to see whether the model comes up with Kepler's laws or Newton's law and so on. They actually show that they can come up with both, but it depends on how you parameterize the system. So the model has never seen any of these laws. They only see the observational data, and they have to come up with a compressed representation that captures the data, like that extrapolates to new data. So, and they do show that it can come up with it, but it depends on like the data set structure. So, but if you have a constrained system that is only doing a specific task, you can actually do interesting things, but it's conditioned on how you specify it. Like you have to push it to a regime where, like I think they had a case where if you want the system to be more compressed, then the Newton's law was a better predictor. If you want the system to be kind of tracking point by point estimate, like more an embedding based approach, then actually it preferred to learn the Kepler's law style because it's a point estimate based learning. So they do show that, okay, depending on how you set up the system, it can do both. So there are cases where they show that it can do it, but in the complete autonomous systems, in that paper, they do talk about people trying to build, like, can you discover oxygen? Like, how did people come up with the idea of coming up when they discovered oxygen? There was like a reaction between lead and oxygen that allows you to kind of isolate oxygen. And they tried a system that was given everything else apart from that. And it really depended on how you provided that information. What they point out is the thing that worked in the end was where people already removed all the unnecessary things and gave it the things that made it easy for the system to solve. But he was saying that back then they didn't even know what are the important components even to kind of give. So, and that's what they're arguing for, that in order to discover that system, like in that case, oxygen, there were other things that one had to kind of solve to even get to the case that, oh, that's what you want to figure out. And that has been, I don't know how rigorously people are testing that. Like, I think now how the foundation model, like how the research system is kind of going is they want to put everything in distribution, right? They keep expanding more and more the space so that you want to put everything in distribution. Like, that's what I think people are trying to do, but I think there should be more tests in like the AI for science case, especially in BA for sciences, to maybe see how you can test systematically out of distribution tasks. It's a good test.
Yeah, I guess like the follow-up question is like, what should be, as a cognitive scientist, what are our North Star questions? Yeah. It's like for AlphaFold, it was like, solving protein folding. Cognitive science is a broad range of stuff. I'm interested in intelligence. Like, what is the North Star question for intelligence? It's like, I don't know, there could be a couple. Maybe that's an offline question, but I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like maybe we'll come to that towards the end. But I think in the future, given how the systems are developing, a lot of the times our energies are getting focused when you're doing these problems on very niche things that probably we are not experts at doing. For example, when I started my PhD, I had to code up behavioral experiments and I had to learn JavaScript and CS to kind of CSS to do that. I'm not an expert in that, and I spent considerable amount of time being an intermediate, like I don't know, being an intermediate level developer to do something else. So you kind of learn a lot of little things, but never to an expert level. So what you can do with the systems is you let the systems do the things that is probably not your expert on, but you can then spend a lot of time thinking deeper into harder questions, which is, for our case, is like what is even the shape of a unifying model for cognition, right? I think I've been reading recently about this, and there is no clear solution, right? Because not much energy has gone into this because people thought, oh, that's such a far away question that people didn't even think about it. But I think now maybe the time is right that you have systems that can take away our time to do the menial stuff, that we can actually think about some of these harder questions. That is something that also is not a one-time thing, right? It's an iterative process where you come up with something, maybe that's not the best one, but you get feedback and you kind of improve that. But it's probably the time to kind of think about those things.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, let's. So the third part is going to be about zooming out even further and thinking about, so far we talked about systems that are, maybe we have pure AI agents that are iterating against each other over time, and the human only specifies the task and that's it. But we can think about cases in which AI agents can behave more interactively, where we have complex human AI systems, whether as a team or maybe even as society in general. We're using AI models and thinking about how can we think about what can or can't be automated, what are the problems that can arise in this process, and how can we study this scientifically. And I should say this is a very new field. Like it's just the beginning of this, so you're not going to see like complicated applications, which maybe it's good because it's the end of the talk. Yeah. So as I said, our society is increasingly hybrid. So even though we're not directly running systems in which we have human and AI interacting in some scientific pipeline, I think we're implicitly already doing that. So if we think about these AI models are trained, usually a foundation model is something like, I don't know, think about ChatGPT or something like that. People are using the system as an assistant, and they get local feedback, whether it's good or not, and then people use that to fine-tune the models. But if we zoom out and think about how actually AI is deployed, it's much more complicated than that, right? There's a whole ecosystem in which humans are interacting with AI systems. These AI systems are, producing either maybe a model or a code or a creative artifact, and it's propagating over time. And all these things can influence, how the outcomes are going to look like and how this is going to shape the whole, scientific ecosystem. So there is a gap. And I think this gap is going to be very relevant also for AI for scientific discovery, which is that these systems, a lot of them are trained on maybe as assistants or maybe on local tasks. But then we ask what happens when they're embedded into larger processes. We are deploying these agents. You can write a paper now with them. Maybe we'll make it all the way up to a machine learning conference or et cetera. But we don't really know, how should we think about, the different ingredients in this process. And we really need to figure out a framework, both as, behavioral scientists and people who care about, collective processes, of how can we study this empirically? What are the lessons that we can draw out of this? So it's almost like also the sociology of this hybrid human AI for behavioral for scientific discovery, but more than that. And this is something that people have started thinking about very seriously. What kinds of hybrid populations will result from these human AI interactive systems? What will be their long-term implications for things like software development or maybe modeling? Under what conditions these collaborations will actually work? And what role humans will play or should play in these processes. What can or can't be automated and why. And this is a very new problem, but not really. I mean, people in the in computational social science have been thinking a lot about how can we, as a collective, try to solve complicated problems, whether, trying to coordinate or figure out a creative solution for something. And maybe they didn't have AI systems, but they definitely thought about how multiple humans interact together in complex architectural, system architectures, and even in their case, I think one of the most striking things was that sometimes a locally beneficial behavior can actually propagate into a collectively disadvantageous behavior, and vice versa. Sometimes having a noisy, crude bot in your system can actually allow the collective to exit from a local minimum and find a better solution. So there's a lot of sort of insight that we can draw from this literature, and we can think about it more seriously when we think about hybrid human AI systems that are trying to solve complicated problems like scientific problems. And so the kind of framework that we've been working on, and I sort of want to advocate, is this complex hybrid simulations where we take the kind of behavioral paradigms that people that studied collective processes have been developing, whether thinking about processes on networks or repeated processes where multiple agents are interacting, and thinking empirically about how these processes shape collective outcomes and what are the sort of messages or conclusions that we can take for science. And I should say the framework we use to run these kind of experiments is called SciNet, which is a collaboration across multiple universities, including Cornell, Cambridge, Princeton, and the Max Planck in Frankfurt. So I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in running online experiments where you have humans and AI participants basically interacting and running through your experiment. And we've been applying this approach to a variety of cases. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I think one of the things that we're interested in is in creative open-ended tasks where there is no obvious specification, maybe something like a creative search, or maybe coming up with a creative piece of writing. But I'm going to focus actually on vibe coding, which is this idea that people now use natural language to ask a system to come up with a model for them, and then seeing how this thing performs, and then giving the system additional instructions and running that further on. And we're going to look at I guess before that, so vibe coding is something that is very useful. I mean, how many of you have vibe coded anything recently? Okay, at least 2/3. Good. So it really empowers individuals, but it's not clear how it shapes the kind of models that we produce or the code solutions that we produce. And there are questions to ask, like, what strategies work best for groups of human and AI agents, and what does the future of code would look like and its quality. And we've been running a little sort of behavioral experiment that simulates this process, and I think there are, even in this very simple task that I'm going to show you, there are conclusions that I think we can take to more complicated problems. So we've been looking at a very simple task where you're trying to ask a system to write a code that produces a sketch. Really very naive in theory kind of task. And basically there is some kind of a mental target in your mind, maybe some kind of an image. And then the participants online, they're literally vibe coding, asking the system to write for them an SVG code that produces a sketch. Then they observe that, they give the system additional feedback, and they keep iterating over that. And it's, you can see it's open-ended, it's very subjective. It's about producing a sketch. And then you can pick your process structure. So we looked at a process in which there's a repeated process in which people observe, say, the artifact. Somebody chooses which of two outcomes is better, and then another person vibe codes a better solution. So you can think about maybe model selection and then vibe coding a better model. Again, very simple case study, but I think it will sort of be illuminating. Okay? And then what we can do is we can run this process with humans, we can run this process with AI models, and we can look at different mixtures and see what happens. So what you can see here is one iterative process where humans just vibe coded with GPT-5. And you can see that basically they start from something not great, but over time things get pretty good. But now if we do this process with GPT-5, so we say, let's forget about humans, I want to automate the whole things with AI models, things don't seem to improve too much. Things, the outcome is kind of warbled. But if we do this across a lot of targets, you can see that there's a systematic problem. These models, when they iterate over themselves, they seem to produce artifact or solutions that are kind of weird. And we can validate that. We can ask people to rate the quality of the code, or not the code actually, the actual sketches that are produced from the code. And a really interesting story comes up. So you can see that when we apply these models initially, so the x-axis is time, the y-axis is ratings by individual humans, you can see that basically everything starts initially in the same area, whether we have humans giving the feedback or the AI giving the feedback, but over time, the quality of solutions starts going down. So there's some kind of a collapse in quality. Whereas the human feedback somehow sustains the quality of solutions over time. And you can ask yourself, what is going on here? Like, why is this happening? And so if we take AI validators instead of humans, ask them to rate the quality of the artifacts, you can see that from the perspective of the AI, it's actually doing, both solutions are pretty good. It's basically they think the same things are working. All good? Yeah, so what you can see here is that basically part of the reason this thing hasn't been working is that there is some kind of misalignment in targets. So you might think that the AI system is doing what you want it to do, but actually it's been optimizing for something else. So this is also something that we should be aware of when we're trying to think about what can or can't be automated to solve a certain task. And you can also look at the kind of human feedback that we get from this. So people are usually give very simple instructions like remove certain details, whereas the AI model gives you this like very complicated, very long description. And in fact, if you've ever tried to ask something like GPT-5 to write you a code solution, or even more complicated models, they tend to give you something, the code equivalent of this. You really need to think about how we regularize these models. And I should say, at least in this simple scenario, regularizing this model just by telling it to write shorter code or shorter descriptions doesn't really solve the problems. It's really, there's something challenging that we really need to think about. And you can also think about role division, like which part of this process should the human be part of? What happens if I remove selectors? What happens if I remove choice? So without spending too much time, the long story short is that having the humans write the high-level instructions and allowing the AI model to just make simple decision, is this locally improving or decreasing, seem to produce the best outcome with the least amount of effort for the humans. But you can't just fully automate the process. So really, having some kind of human in the loop is really important for achieving a good, code solution. So to summarize, in this case, we saw that humans generate uniquely effective high-level instructions for vibe coding. Sometimes when the models start iterating over themselves, even though they start at a good place, you might see some kind of a performance collapse, and maybe human feedback can help mitigate that. And then finally, more broadly, we should really think about how we build these hybrid human AI systems to write code or solve complicated creative problems in a sort of empirical way, just the way we've been always doing in the behavioral sciences, and think about what architecture do I need, what can or can't be automated, and how does that help me. Yeah, so to conclude, I guess, we saw that AI systems are really transforming the process of the scientific discovery. We talked a lot about how it's been applied in the behavioral sciences, whether as a comparison class that allows us to sort of contrast against human behavior, make inferences about core questions, things like zooming out one step further and using AI agents, as facilitators of scientific pipelines, and finally zooming out even further and asking, how is this changing the whole ecosystem of how we solve problems as humans are now augmented by AI, and what can or can't be automated, what are the targets we should care about, and how can we make a science of this, scientific process. Yeah, and so that's pretty much it. And we wanted to end with thinking about how would this apply to your field, or if you have any thoughts about how it could be improved in cognitive science, or just answering questions in general. So yeah. Thank you.